I woke up to the sound of my alarm, the usual 6:30 a.m. buzz that told me the day had started. I rolled out of bed, a habit ingrained in me from years of early mornings. The same routine every day: shower, get dressed, make some coffee, and head to work. As usual, Emily was already at the kitchen table, eating her breakfast. She didn't say much in the morning, just small talk, plans for the day, who had called yesterday, the usual stuff. "Morning," I muttered, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. She looked up, her eyes were tired, like always. She was only 32, but she looked older in the mornings. It bothered me, but I couldn't figure out why. "Good morning," she replied, barely glancing at me. She didn't seem angry, but there was something in her voice, something off. "I have to meet Sarah later, and I might go to the grocery store." "Yeah, all right," I said, barely processing what she said. I was already thinking about the work I had ahead of me. The corporate grind had its hold on me, and if I'm being honest, Emily's needs felt like a distant second. I wasn't neglecting her on purpose. It just never seemed like there was enough time for anything else. I grabbed my bag, kissed her cheek, half-hearted, really, and headed out the door. She didn't even look up. I thought about that for a second, but then I shrugged it off. It's just Emily being Emily, I thought. It was another one of those mornings. John left early, like always, barely saying goodbye. I couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment every time he did that. We used to have breakfast together, talk about our plans, our day. But now, it was just routine, mechanical. There was no spark anymore. I sat at the table, sipping my coffee, staring out the window at nothing in particular. The house was quiet, too quiet. It had been like this for months, maybe longer. I used to think it was just a phase, that things would get better once John was more settled at work. But now, I wasn't so sure. My friend Sarah had noticed something was off when we met last week. She'd asked, gently, if everything was okay with John. I hadn't really answered. What was there to say? That I was suffocating? That the man I had married, the man who used to make me feel seen, had become a stranger? At work, it was the same. I tried to focus, tried to push through the days, but everything felt distant. My colleagues, especially Molly, noticed my detachment. "You okay, Em?" she asked me the other day. "You seem off." I just shrugged it off. "I'm fine," I lied. What else was I supposed to say? That my marriage was falling apart? That I felt invisible? No, that wasn't something I could talk about at work. After work, I met Sarah for a drink. She listened as I vented about everything, about how John and I barely talked anymore, how he never seemed to notice when something was wrong, how I felt so alone. She was sympathetic, of course, but her advice always felt like a platitude. "You need to talk to him, Em. Tell him what you need." But I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't even know where to begin. It felt like it was too late for that. Work was the same as always, endless emails, meetings, calls that dragged on. It was all necessary, but after a while, it became just a way to avoid the reality at home. I wasn't unhappy in my marriage, or at least, I didn't think I was. Emily had her moments where she seemed distant, but I chalked it up to stress. We'd been together for a while now, and I was just too tired to try to fix what didn't seem broken. That was until the neighbor showed up. Andy. The guy had moved in a couple of months ago, and I didn't think much of it at first. He was young, early 20s, friendly, but I didn't really have time to focus on him. Then, one Saturday, I noticed Emily talking to him outside. They were laughing, and he was carrying a bag of groceries inside. I just figured he was being neighborly, but as the weeks went by, he kept showing up, helping Emily with repairs around the house, carrying groceries, fixing things in the yard. I barely noticed it at first, too wrapped up in my own world. But one evening, I came home from work late, and there he was again, standing in the yard, talking to Emily. They seemed too comfortable, too at ease with each other. I didn't say anything. I just walked past them, nodded, and went inside. I didn't want to be the jealous husband, accusing her of something without any reason, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was just me being paranoid, I told myself. And then there was Andy. At first, he just seemed like a friendly neighbor. He would stop by to help with things around the house, fixing a broken faucet, hanging some pictures I had been meaning to put up. He was always so calm, so patient with me. He never rushed, never seemed distracted. He would look at me with that warm smile, and I couldn't help but feel noticed, like I mattered for the first time in a long while. John was never home long enough to even notice when something needed fixing. I'd ask him to help, but he'd always have an excuse. Work. Meetings. I didn't want to burden him with more of my problems. So, Andy was a breath of fresh air. He paid attention to me in a way I hadn't experienced in so long. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. A compliment here, a joke there. One day, while we were fixing a loose cabinet, his hand brushed mine. It was just for a moment, but it felt like an eternity. That was the first time I realized something had changed inside me. I hadn't felt this kind of connection in years, and it made my heart race in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to ignore it. I tried to push those feelings away. But the more time I spent with Andy, the harder it became to pretend everything was fine. I started looking forward to his visits, the way he made me feel alive again. I told Sarah about it, about how Andy had been helping me with so many things, how he'd started to make me feel seen. It's just kindness, I told Sarah, trying to convince myself. He's just being a good neighbor. But Sarah wasn't convinced. You have to decide, Em, she said. Do you want things to change with John? Or are you just looking for something more? John had been working late again, his usual routine of endless meetings and corporate demands. I didn't mind. It gave me some space to think, to reflect on everything that had been happening lately. I wasn't sure where things were heading with Andy, but each time he came over to help, it felt like the world was shifting around me. That evening, he knocked on the door around 7, a bottle of wine in hand. I thought you might need a break, he said, his smile as easy and warm as always. I had been fixing a shelf in the living room, and I welcomed the interruption. We sat together, sharing the wine, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like it had always been this way. But this time, it felt different. There was a tension between us, something unspoken, lingering in the air. I could feel his eyes on me, a softness in his gaze that I hadn't seen in a long time. It made me uncomfortable at first, but then, it was like a magnet pulling me closer. His hand brushed mine, and I didn't pull away. He leaned in slowly, his face inches from mine. For a moment, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, without a word, his lips were on mine. It wasn't like the kisses I had shared with John in the past. It was desperate, filled with a hunger I hadn't realized I needed. Andy kissed me like I mattered, like I was everything. And for the first time in months, I felt wanted. I felt like I was finally seen in a way that John had never been able to make me feel. I kissed him back, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions that flooded me. The guilt, the excitement, the fear. It was all too much, but it felt so right. Afterward, we pulled apart, breathless. I'm sorry, Andy said, his voice rough. I didn't mean to. But I stopped him, placing a finger on his lips. Don't apologize. I needed that. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the fact that I had been waiting for someone to make me feel alive again, and Andy had done that. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't deny how much I craved his attention. I hadn't realized how much I had been starving for it until it was right there in front of me. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The kiss wasn't just a kiss. It was the beginning of something I knew I couldn't turn away from. There was a part of me that felt like I should stop, that I should tell Andy it was a mistake. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had to tell someone. So I called Sarah. She was the only one who wouldn't judge me, or at least, that's what I told myself. I met her at the same cafe where we always went for our heart-to-heart talks. She listened as I confessed everything. The kiss, the emotions, the guilt. I expected her to scold me, to tell me how wrong I was. But instead, she was surprisingly calm. Emily, she said gently, I won't judge you, but you need to think about where this is headed. You can't keep doing this. It'll destroy you. I looked at her, feeling torn. I don't know if I can stop. I feel alive when I'm with him. She sighed, taking a sip of her coffee. I get it. I do. But you need to think about what this is really about. You're not just looking for someone else's attention. You're looking for yourself. And if you keep going down this path, you won't just hurt John, you'll You'll hurt yourself, too. I didn't want to hear it. I wasn't ready to hear it. But part of me knew she was right. And yet, I couldn't stop. Every time Andy touched me, every time he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world, I felt like I was finally getting the validation I had been craving for so long. Back home, things with John were getting colder. He had started to notice the distance between us. We barely spoke anymore. Whenever we did, it was just small talk, about work, about the house, about nothing. I could feel the tension building, but I didn't know how to fix it. John had started suggesting things. Us spending more time together, going out, doing something other than just existing in the same house. But it didn't seem to matter. I didn't want to be with him anymore. One evening, after another pointless conversation about nothing, he asked, "Why don't you want to spend time with me anymore? We used to enjoy each other's company." I didn't know how to answer him. "I'm just busy," I said, hoping it would satisfy him. But it didn't. He kept pressing, asking me about my plans, about how much time I'd been spending with the neighbors. The questions stung, but I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't tell him that someone else had been giving me the attention I needed, that someone else had made me feel alive again. He seemed frustrated, but didn't push further. The quiet between us stretched on, and I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before he figured it out. And then there was Andy. Our meetings were becoming more frequent. It started with him helping me with small repairs around the house, but it quickly became something else. Every time he came over, we spent more time together, talking, laughing, and the lines between friendship and something more started to blur. I didn't even try to stop it anymore. Every time he touched me, I felt more and more like I mattered. I told myself it was just about the attention, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I had become emotionally dependent on him. One day, John came home early from work. I was sitting on the couch, talking to Andy in the living room. He didn't seem to notice anything at first, but when he saw Andy standing so close to me, I could see the confusion in his eyes. "Andy, I didn't realize you were still here," John said, his voice a little too calm. Andy gave a quick smile. "Yeah, just helping Emily out with a few things." I nodded, but the weight of John's gaze on me made my chest tighten. I could see the doubt in his eyes, and part of me hated that he was noticing, but another part of me knew it was only a matter of time before he found out. It felt like everything was spinning out of control. I wasn't sure what to do anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't stop seeing Andy, that I didn't want to. And as much as I told myself I could handle it, deep down, I knew I was getting too deep into something I couldn't easily walk away from. The affair with Andy had become a regular part of my life. It wasn't just the occasional stolen kiss anymore. It was planned, deliberate, and inevitable. Every time John was at work, I found myself with Andy, and the intimacy between us grew deeper. What started out as a physical attraction quickly turned into something more complex, something I hadn't expected. I began to feel connected to him in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. With Andy, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to put on a mask and act like everything was fine. He saw me, really saw me, and that feeling, that acknowledgement, made me feel like I was finally alive again. But as the days went by, I began to realize that my feelings for him were growing. It wasn't just about the physical side of our encounters anymore. I started imagining a future with him, a life where I didn't have to pretend anymore, a future where I didn't have to live in the shadow of my marriage, a future where I was truly happy. But even as I thought about it, I knew it was a huge risk. What if John found out? What if everything fell apart? I tried to push those thoughts away, but they lingered, haunting me. Each time Andy left, each time I said goodbye, I felt a part of me longing for more. More of his time, more of his attention, more of what he made me feel. It wasn't just about escaping my marriage. It was about something I couldn't fully explain. With Andy, I felt seen, desired, wanted in a way that John hadn't made me feel in years. And for the first time in a long while, I began to believe that I could be happy again. It wasn't long before things started to unravel. One evening, I was in the living room, texting Andy about our next meeting, when I accidentally left my phone on the kitchen counter. John had come home early from work that day. He picked up my phone to check something, and that's when he saw the messages. I didn't know he had found them at first, but later, as we sat at the dinner table, I saw the look in his eyes. a mixture of confusion and hurt. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the weight of his silence. That night, I went to bed early, trying to avoid his questions. But I knew it was only a matter of time before he confronted me. The next day, John was distant, withdrawn. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was in short, clipped sentences. My heart sank when I saw him glancing at my phone again, his eyes lingering on the messages I had thought were hidden. At first, he didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept what was staring him in the face. But the more he looked, the more the evidence piled up. I could see it in the way he moved around the house, the way his hands shook when he reached for a cup of coffee. The truth was breaking him, but instead of confronting me immediately, he kept his distance. And I didn't know if that made things worse or better. John wasn't one to show emotion, and I knew from the look on his face that this was tearing him apart. But rather than confronting me, he seemed to be retreating into himself, observing, taking notes, waiting for the right moment. I couldn't read him anymore. It felt like we were living in two separate worlds. Days passed, and I tried to keep up appearances, but I felt the tension growing between us. One evening, as I was coming back from the store, I saw John talking to our neighbor, Mark. They didn't seem to be talking about anything important, but I noticed the way John was looking at him, his expression tight, like he was trying to gather information. I tried to ignore it, but the next day, I overheard him talking to Robert, his friend. John was asking about Andy, about his whereabouts, and whether anyone had seen him around. He was doing what I feared most. He was starting to put the pieces together. He was asking the right questions, the questions that would lead him to the truth. That was when I started to suspect that John might know about the affair, but he hadn't confronted me yet. I could feel it in the way he was watching me, the way he was being extra careful with his words. The guilt inside me was eating away at me. I was living a double life, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep it up. I wanted to be with Andy, but at the same time, I was terrified of what would happen if John found out for sure. I didn't know what was worse, the affair itself, or the fallout that would come when it all came crashing down. Meanwhile, John had begun to take a more subtle approach. I didn't know how, but somehow, he had started spreading rumors about Andy. It wasn't direct, nothing obvious. But I began to notice whispers in the neighborhood, little comments from people who barely knew Andy. At first, it seemed like nothing. But then, I overheard Mark talking about Andy's secret relationships. "I heard he's been seeing someone else," Mark said one day, when John was out of earshot. I didn't need to ask who he was talking about. It was me. John was planting seeds of doubt, carefully turning the attention away from our marriage and onto Andy. It didn't stop there. I later learned that John had sent anonymous messages to Andy's family, hinting at the affair. He was slowly starting to unravel Andy's life, exposing bits and pieces of our secret to the world. And I watched it happen, powerless to stop it. I felt a twisted mix of guilt and relief. Guilt because I was complicit in this, but relief because it wasn't me facing the consequences of our actions. It was Andy. Andy didn't see it coming. He started feeling the pressure, the tension building in his own life. His friends started to question him, his family was suspicious, and he couldn't understand why. Slowly, his relationships with everyone began to fall apart. The cracks were appearing, and I could see the toll it was taking on him. He became more distant, more withdrawn, as if the weight of the secret was finally starting to get to him. I knew I was part of the reason he was falling apart, but I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't stop seeing him, couldn't stop wanting him. But at the same time, I was terrified of the consequences. I had started to feel like I was living on borrowed time. John knew something was up, and I could see the way he was waiting for the perfect moment to expose me. My mind was a mess. I wanted Andy, but I knew everything was falling apart around me. The guilt, the fear, the anticipation of the moment when everything would come crashing down. It was too much to bear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that John was already one step ahead, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to destroy everything I had built with Andy. It was an evening like any other when it happened. Emily had gone to a friend's house, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. I didn't plan on looking through her things, but I needed to check an email. It was supposed to be quick, nothing more than a simple task. But when I opened her phone, I saw a message from Andy. I couldn't help myself. I opened it. What I read made my stomach drop. There it was, in black and white. Emily's confession, written with an openness that felt like a slap in the face. "I've missed you so much," the message began. "Every moment we've spent together makes me feel alive again. I can't remember the last time I felt this way." The rest of it followed in a similar vein, how she felt wanted by him, how he made her feel alive, how she couldn't wait to see him again. My hands shook as I read each word. The betrayal was overwhelming. At first, I couldn't believe it. I thought maybe it was some kind of mistake, that it couldn't possibly be what it seemed. But as I read more, I felt the weight of the truth sink in. This wasn't just a physical affair. This was emotional. This was everything I had feared and more. She wasn't just with him because of physical attraction. She was with him because she needed him. And in a sick way, that made it worse. My mind raced as the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to scream, to rage. But something inside me told me not to act hastily. I needed to be smarter than that. I couldn't let my anger cloud my judgment. Instead of confronting Emily, I decided to observe her. I would watch how she reacted, and I would figure out how to make her understand the depth of her betrayal without giving her the chance to deflect or justify it. The next evening, Emily came home, seemingly unaware that everything had changed. She walked through the door, greeted me casually, and asked about my day as if nothing had happened. The calmness in her voice irritated me. She seemed so unaffected. I watched her, studying her movements, her expressions. For a few moments, I said nothing. We just sat there, in the uncomfortable silence that had grown between us. Finally, I broke the stillness. "I know what's been going on, Emily. I know about you and Andy." My voice was steady, controlled, though inside I was raging. She froze, her face draining of color. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I could see the panic flash across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it. But I had already seen the truth in the messages. There was no way out for her. She tried, of course, to explain herself. "John, it's not what you think," she began, her voice faltering. "You don't understand. I felt neglected. You've been so distant, and Andy, he made me feel alive again." Her words hit me like daggers, but I remained calm. She was trying to justify her actions, but nothing she said could erase the reality of what she had done. "So this was the solution? You cheated. You betrayed everything we built because you felt neglected?" My voice barely rose, but I could feel the weight of every word. She didn't know how to respond. She was caught, and instead of owning it, she kept trying to explain it away, to make it sound like I was the reason. I listened, but my mind wasn't on her words anymore. I was already thinking about how I would make her feel the consequences of her actions. She had no idea what was coming. I didn't confront Andy immediately. That would have been too obvious, too quick. Instead, I began to manipulate the situation. I focused on creating emotional distance between Emily and me. I became colder, more indifferent. I threw myself into my work, barely acknowledging her when she was home. I knew she could feel the change, but I made sure I didn't give her anything to hold on to. At the same time, I began subtly working on Andy's life. I had heard rumors from neighbors about his past, things that were less than flattering. So I started spreading them. Nothing direct, nothing too obvious, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. I spoke to people who knew him, mentioned things I had heard, and slowly, those whispers made their way to Jenna, Andy's girlfriend. I didn't have to do much. Jenna, already suspicious, began questioning Andy about his behavior. "I've heard things," she said one evening. "People are talking about you, about Emily. Is there something you're not telling me?" The tension between them was palpable, and I could see it starting to strain their relationship. The rumors, the doubts, were starting to take their toll. Meanwhile, Emily was feeling the weight of her own guilt. She could see that I wasn't the same. I wasn't warm or understanding anymore. I was distant, and every time she tried to reach out to me, I shut her down. It hurt me to do it, but I knew it was necessary. She had to feel the isolation, the loneliness that I had been living with for months. But it wasn't just me she was struggling with. Sarah, her one constant source of support, was starting to distance herself, too. I knew this would happen. Sarah had always been empathetic, but now she was torn between her loyalty to Emily and her sense of right and wrong. Emily would confide in her, but even Sarah seemed unsure of what to say anymore. I overheard part of a conversation between them one day. "You need to make a decision, Emily," Sarah said. "You can't keep living like this. You're tearing yourself apart." It was the guilt that really started to gnaw at Emily. She knew what she had done was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to end things with Andy. Every time she thought about it, she was torn. She knew she had betrayed me, but Andy had become her escape, the one person who made her feel like she mattered. I watched all of this, silently. The cracks in her life were growing wider, and I was letting it all unfold. Emily was living a double life, and she had no idea how much closer I was to revealing the truth. I wasn't just waiting for the right moment. I was planning my next move, and when the time came, everything would fall apart. Andy, for his part, was starting to feel the pressure. Jenna's suspicions were growing, and the rumors about his affair with Emily were starting to weigh on him. He tried to brush it off, to deny it, but it was getting harder to ignore. His relationship with Jenna was deteriorating, and I could see the stress building in him. The guilt, the fear, the pressure. It was all starting to unravel, and I knew that soon he would crack. The game was in motion. The pieces were falling into place, and Emily had no idea how much her world was about to change. Jenna had heard enough. After weeks of growing suspicion, the whispers and rumors swirling around Andy's relationship with Emily had reached a boiling point. One evening, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She confronted him, demanding the truth. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of hurt and disbelief as she asked, "Is there something going on with you and Emily?" "I've heard things, Andy. People are talking." Andy was caught off guard. His mind raced, his mouth went dry, and for the first time, he realized just how much trouble he was in. He stumbled over his words, trying to deny it, but his guilt was too heavy. In a moment of vulnerability, he broke. It's true. I've been seeing her. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did." Jenna stood there, her face crumpling with the weight of his confession. She could hardly believe it. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Andy standing in the doorway, shattered and alone. In the days that followed, Andy's world began to crumble. Not only was his affair with Emily now out in the open, but now he had lost Jenna, too. He spent countless nights alone, drowning in regret, wondering how he had allowed everything to fall apart. The excitement of the affair, the thrill of the deception, seemed so insignificant now. The pain of losing Jenna hit him harder than he could have ever anticipated. But by then, it was too late. He had no one to blame but himself. Back in Emily's world, the pressure was mounting. As Andy struggled to cope with the fallout from his relationship with Jenna, Emily began to experience her own breakdown. The guilt from her affair and the collapse of her marriage to John weighed heavily on her, each passing day making it more difficult to breathe. She could feel the cracks in her life deepening as everything she had taken for granted seemed to slip away. She tried to talk to Andy about the future, but he was distant. His own emotional turmoil from his broken relationship with Jenna clouded his ability to give her the reassurance she desperately craved. Every time Emily reached out to him, he pulled back, absorbed in his own guilt and regret. She started to feel more alone than ever. The loneliness that had pushed her into Andy's arms now seemed even more suffocating. She questioned everything, the affair, her marriage, her decisions, and realized, with growing clarity, that she had ruined everything. Her marriage to John, her friendship with Sarah, and her relationship with Andy had all been shattered by her own choices. Meanwhile, John had been watching from the sidelines as Andy's life began to implode. The emotional distance between him and Emily had become irreparable, and it was time to make his move. He had gathered enough evidence, enough rumors, to turn this affair into a public spectacle. He began planning a dinner with a few close friends, people who were connected to both him and Andy. As they sat around the table, John casually brought up the affair. He dropped hints, made subtle comments, and watched as the shockwaves spread through the group. By the time the evening was over, the rumors were already in motion. The entire neighborhood would soon know about the affair, and the walls around Emily and Andy's secret life would come crashing down. John also made sure to shift the blame. He subtly planted the idea that Emily wasn't the only one responsible, that it was Andy who had seduced her, who had manipulated her into this affair. He painted him as the villain, shifting the focus from Emily's guilt to Andy's actions. This gave John a sense of control over the narrative, a way to make sure that Emily wasn't the only one left to shoulder the weight of the betrayal. The final blow came when John arranged a public confrontation. He invited Emily and Andy to dinner, bringing them together in front of a small group of their friends and neighbors. As they sat there, laughing and talking, John remained calm. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as he laid out all the evidence he had gathered, the messages, the rumors, the lies. Emily's face went pale as she realized what was happening. Andy, caught off guard, tried to defend himself, but it was too late. John had already exposed everything. The room fell silent as Emily's tears began to flow. She was humiliated, unable to hide from the truth any longer. Andy's reputation was shattered in an instant, and Emily, once a respected member of the community, was now seen as nothing more than a cheater. The damage was done, and John stood back, watching as the chaos unfolded. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but it was hollow. The feeling of victory was overshadowed by something darker, something that made him question whether he had gone too far. In the days that followed, both Emily and Andy's lives began to unravel. Emily found herself ostracized by her social circle as people distanced themselves from her. Friends who once adored her now looked at her with disdain, and even family members began to pull away. Andy, too, became a pariah. His career took a hit as colleagues turned their backs on him, and many of his friends cut ties. The shame of his actions followed him wherever he went, and he realized too late how much he had lost. Emily, devastated by the fallout from both her marriage and the affair, retreated into herself. She had lost everything that had once defined her. The future she had imagined with Andy seemed unreachable now. The emotional scars from the affair, from the betrayal of John, from the public scandal, would haunt her for the rest of her life. She spent long hours reflecting on the choices that led her to this point. She had taken her marriage with John for granted, and now she had nothing left. John, on the other hand, had achieved his revenge. He watched as Emily and Andy spiraled into ruin, knowing that his actions had caused them both irreversible damage. But as the weeks went by, a sense of emptiness crept in. He had won the battle, but in doing so, he had lost something far more valuable: his ability to trust, love, or heal. His marriage was gone, and any chance of redemption seemed impossible. In the end, both Emily and Andy were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape the consequences of their actions. And for John, the victory had come at a cost he wasn't sure he was prepared to pay.